Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, I just want to check in and make sure that everyone can hear me and see the PowerPoint. So if everything looks and sounds great, please let me know in your chat box. Oh, yeah. All right, it looks like one last chance. Anyone want to speak up if you're having any, I guess if you can't hear me, you won't be able to answer this, but just double checking that it sounds good to everyone. And we'll begin in 1 minute. Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for this morning's webinar, Crucial Conversations, Tools Needed for Important Conversations. My name is Nathan Schulman, and I am with the Tennessee Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. A little about me. Prior to starting my work at the Coalition in April, I worked for 6 years for the YWCA of Nashville, Middle Tennessee at their domestic violence shelter. So before we get started, a little transparency at the start. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is pulled from a specific book called Crucial Conversations by Carrie Patterson, Joseph Grenny, Ron McMillan, and Al Switzler. So certainly as we start going through all this, if there's any particular topic that you find especially interesting, if it's something you'd like to know more about, have access to some more theoretical scenarios, exercises, I would absolutely recommend that you pick up this book. It's a great thing for the majority of what we're going to be talking about today. And what are we talking about today? First, we're going to be talking about what a crucial conversation is, and just as importantly, why people fear it, avoid it, and why they sometimes don't go well. And in keeping with that theme, we're going to be talking about deliberate speech and keeping the conversation safe, which is one of the ways that we sustain and make a crucial conversation matter. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about communication and trauma. Certainly, given what the Coalition does, and I'd imagine most of what you guys are doing, we are often working with victims of domestic and sexual violence, which, as we know, can lead to various levels of PTSD and trauma, which can affect communication, because we know that trauma affects the brain and it affects the way that we're able to communicate. So what is a crucial conversation? It is a discussion between two or more people where 1, stakes are high, 2, opinions vary, and 3, emotions run strong. I'm sure we can all relate to that scenario. So common examples in life could be, ending a relationship, giving a coworker or boss feedback that you might be uncomfortable about for whatever reason, asking your roommate to move out, confronting a loved one about something sensitive, and again, I'm sure the list goes on and on and on, and we can all think of numerous times we've been in what feels like a crucial conversation. And then within the work of advocacy, certainly there are plenty of crucial conversations. As advocates, we're often very involved in substantial manners, where the margin of error has real consequences and risks. And if you're a survivor affected by trauma, with a limited safety net, most conversations are understandably going to feel very crucial. So looking as an advocate, anything like case management goals, safety planning, discussing the end of a shelter stay, especially if it's uncertain, what the next step is. These are all very crucial conversations. Oh, sorry about that, everyone. So what holds us back from having the crucial conversation in the first place? A large reason is what is known as the fool's choice. And that is the belief that we need to choose between telling the truth and preserving a relationship or status quo. And this is a lesson that can get ingrained in us at a really early age without really even realizing it, and it's often enforced, by cultural norms. So an example I can give of when you maybe first encountered a crucial conversation without, realizing, or other fool's choice, without even realizing it was happening was, let's say you're a kiddo and you're at your grandma's house, and grandma put something on the dinner table that you don't want to eat. No offense to grandma, you just don't like Brussels sprouts. Maybe if you're an outspoken child, you might even say to your parents, I don't want to eat that. When the response back likely is some variation of, eat your food, you don't want to hurt grandma's feelings. So right there, you have the two options. The option one, you can speak up and potentially hurt your grandma's feelings, or option two, you can suffer in silence and eat something you don't enjoy. That's obviously a youthful version, but we can definitely dress it up into an adult scenario. Let's say that you are at a work meeting and your boss suggests a plan for moving forward for the company or organization that you either suspect or maybe you know for a fact isn't going to do well, and could possibly lead to problems. Looking at the fool's choice, the option is speak up and turn your boss, into an enemy potentially, upset them, upset the last person you want to upset in your job, or suffer in silence and go along with a decision that might negatively affect the company. So how do we get around the fool's choice? The plan and the goal is to change the internal discussion you might be having from an either or choice and find that and option. So going back to the example of a boss making a suggestion you believe is wrong, the goal should be moving from the thought process of, I can speak up and lose or support or let the company suffer, to how can I speak about my concerns with decision and show my boss that I still respect them overall as a leader. There are some other communication traps in addition to the fool's choice that can get in the way, hamper, hinder, or even keep a crucial conversation from happening. So you have your original motive, going into a conversation, what you're trying to argue, what you want to convince the other person of, but these other traps can happen. There's good old-fashioned desire to win. Sometimes the competitive drive can kick in too quickly if we're not careful, and the motive of having a nuanced and collaborative discussion can slide into that black and white desire to come out on top. There's punishing, if anger creeps in and begins to increase, we can move from wanting to win the argument to wanting to upset or harm the other person, hopefully just emotionally. So think of any time an argument turned heated and someone through it that makes a comment that isn't necessarily pertinent or true, but still holds substantial space in the conversation. It's like if the debate is about how to best structure timesheets, and one person criticizes another for their attendance record. Yeah, it's kind of related to timesheets because of attendance, but it has nothing at all to do with, structuring of timesheets. It doesn't help solve the matter at hand, while discouraging others from feeling safe to contribute to the discussion, which leads us to keeping the peace, which is a very common trap that is all more likely if anyone in the conversation is already on a winning or punishing tear. It's choosing safety over dialogue and choosing the certainty of a bad result over the possibility of an uncomfortable situation. So how do we avoid that? The first step, of course, is keeping the conversation focused. And the best way to do that is, initially accepting that human limitation. The only person you can directly control is yourself. Certainly the goal is to change someone else's opinion, convince them otherwise if they're meeting resistance to your plan. But at the end of the day, that decision is within them. So all you can do is, watch yourself, watch your motive, and do the best you can to present it to them. And it's important to be thinking about your motive as you're going through the conversation, because it might change, and it might change for a good reason. Maybe it's changing because things are getting really collaborative and ideas are being brought that you hadn't thought of. But maybe it's changing because one of those traps. Maybe it's changing because you just want to win now, or it's all about getting some licks in if someone is upsetting you emotionally, or maybe you're afraid and want to run away. So it's important to think about what is my motive throughout it. You want to focus on what you want for yourself, for others in the situation, and for the relationship that the conversation is based around. Certainly the goal, is that everyone is contributing to a shared pool of meaning, where all the ideas find their way into the open to be considered. So the book Crucial Conversations has a really helpful acrostic state to remind you of ways to speak persuasively and not abrasively. So first, you want to share your facts. Facts are more persuasive than subjective claims, in addition to having the lowest chance of insulting others. You want to begin with facts before story so others can see the path of your argument from start to finish. And then you want to tell your story, the reason why you're bringing up the facts in the first place. The story puts your facts in their intended context and allows you to control their implications. This humanizing element will elevate facts and keep them from being tuned out as dry data. Someone could certainly walk into a meeting and drop a thick stack of data on the table and go, this is why I'm right. And while maybe technically, if someone really goes through the data, they might conclude the same thing, it's probably not going to go far in the conversation because, their response is probably going to be, well, tell me why. That's where that story comes in. You want to ask for others' paths, encourage them to share their facts and stories. So the key to sharing sensitive ideas is to blend confidence with humility. You're expressing confidence with your facts and accompanying story, but to demonstrate humility, you want to ask others for their views as well. If either their facts or stories are lacking in coherence, and you can always ask clarifying questions to help them succeed in making their point. It might seem a little bit counterintuitive to bolster a counter-argument, one that you are arguing against, but in the end, this can help foster mutual purpose and respect, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. You want to talk tentatively, not timidly. While humility is important, you don't want to undersell your point either. So you're best off straddling the line, where you strategically soften the message without losing its confidence. Now, within your story, you can combine the validity of your facts with qualifiers like, in my opinion, or after talking with several concerned parties, ... You're making that convincing argument while avoiding the perception that you believe you're incapable of error, all-knowing, or that you're forcing your argument through. And then lastly, you want to encourage testing. You want to keep others from making that fool's choice and ensure that consensus is authentically being found. You can play direct hand in this by asking for contrasting opinions or another side of the story that maybe you hadn't considered yet. If no one is comfortable speaking out, playing devil's advocate can sometimes help prompt discussion as well. Above all, you want to keep the conversation safe. You want to engage on content, the topic and discussion, but keep an eye on that condition, how others are responding, and what the vibe in the room is as they're having this conversation. And again, going back to the idea that in a day, you're only truly responsible for yourself. You want to self-monitor your own condition as you're going through and make sure that you're feeling safe and operating from the best place possible. We're all different. We all have our different signs, but there's pretty common physical, emotional, behavioral signs that maybe something's changing. Suddenly your stomach might clench, or you realize you're feeling an overwhelming emotion that you weren't expecting in the meeting. Maybe suddenly you have a finger up in the air pointing. So it's important to keep an eye on that and monitor how safe the conversation feels both for yourself and others. So the common reactions to an unsafe conversation normally fall into two categories: silence or violence. With silence consists of any act that purposely withholds information from the shared discussion and is usually done to avoid any potential problems. There's masking, which consists of understating or selectively showing true opinions through methods like sarcasm or sugarcoating. There's avoiding, which is steering completely away from sensitive topics and talking around any potential controversial manners. And there's withdrawing, which means pulling out of the conversation altogether, either by going quiet or literally leaving the room. And then violence consists of any verbal strategy that attempts to convince, control, or compel others to your point of view. Controlling consists of coercing others to your way of thinking, either by forcing views or dominating the conversation. Common tactics that I'm sure we're all familiar with is, cutting others off, overstating facts, speaking in absolutes, or changing the subject at hand. Labeling is putting a label on people or ideas so that they are more easily dismissed under a general stereotype. And then, there's attacking, which is pretty self-explanatory, and it's similar to that punishing communication trap we talked about earlier. It's when someone no longer cares about winning the argument, they just want to hurt the other person's emotions or credibility. And we all have different styles under stress, and we're all going to experience stress. So when I'm talking about stress, it's not how do we eliminate it, because one, I'm pretty sure it's biologically impossible, and two, if it was easy to do, someone would have marketed it by now. So stress is here to stay, and it's not to say that you can eliminate it entirely from the situation, but the better you understand your own style under stress, the better prepared you're going to be to meet those, changing conditions as they start happening. Especially if you're already navigating the facts and stories, to be comfortable with your body and your stress to the point that can be a little bit on autopilot, means you're going to be juggling less all at once. So here are a couple of true-false statements. Again, there's no truly wrong or right answer because we're all different and we react differently. The matter is just to understand where you're at, So, when you're talking with people, do you tell them exactly what you think, or do you sometimes, throw a little bit of flattering compliments in to maybe soften the blow? Do you tend to exaggerate your side of the argument if you really want to get your point across? In the middle of a tough conversation, you often get so caught up that you don't see how you're coming across to others. And sometimes, do you struggle with harsh feedback because you're afraid of the problems it might create? Again, there's nothing wrong with, whatever this answer is for you. It's just a matter of becoming familiar with it and knowing how to manage it to the best of your abilities. And then when you notice safety is at risk, the first thing you want to do really is step out of the content and address the safety concerns, because you're not going to get anywhere if someone is not feeling safe, because you're really not having a true conversation at that point. So you want to rebuild that safety, and find the mutual purpose and the mutual respect. Crucial conversations can often go awry because people are doubting the purpose or intent of the conversation rather than the content being discussed. So mutual purpose means that others perceive that you're working towards a common outcome and that you care about their goals and values as well. Now, as we've talked about, encouraging testing from others is a great way to build trust for your motive and your belief in mutual purpose. And then mutual respect, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I mean, if you think about it, the moment people perceive disrespect in a situation, the interaction is no longer about that original purpose. It's about defending one's dignity. So you can have all the right facts and all the right stories, but if the other person thinks that, agreeing or conceding or coming over to your side, means that they are accepting a personal slight, you're probably not going to get there no matter how convincing your argument is. So how do you regain that purpose and respect? Well, if necessary, you apologize. We're all human, and sometimes we do say statements that might insult someone, and it's, hopefully it's not intentional, but, one of the best ways to get that mutual respect back and to show humility is to apologize. Now, sometimes, though, you might, insult someone, but it really wasn't intended. So while you could apologize, it's not going to come off as sincere. And people can pick up on that pretty quickly. And an insincere apology is going to do nothing for that mutual respect or purpose. So if someone's offended, but they don't really deserve a straight up, normal apology, what do? Well, you can contrast, with a don't do statement. So you want to address the other's concerns that there's a lack of respect or mutual purpose, but then as well confirm your respect and clarify, the purpose. So there's that don't and do. So let's say that you're in a meeting and maybe you're leading the meeting and you're telling everyone, look, this project is bigger than we initially anticipated. We need to work harder. We need to work longer hours. And someone takes immediate offense to that and reads that statement as you're saying you don't care about the job. That's not what you meant. Again, so for that reason, a straightforward apology wouldn't really go far. So you can use that don't do contrasting statement. You start with a don't. I don't mean to convey that you aren't invested in the success of this project, and then follow it up with the do. Your contributions so far have been vital to getting us where we currently are at. Which can then allow you to keep going with your point, so which is, I don't see a way around increasing the work hours of this to be done on time. It's important to remember that, contrasting is not apologizing. It's a way of ensuring that what we said doesn't upset anyone more than it should have to. The example I just gave, you can't control if someone is upset that they have to work longer hours. It just is what it is. You can at least correct the misperception that you're accusing them of not caring. So I want to switch gears and talk a little about the brain and how trauma can physically affect how it works. So the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala are all part of the neural circuitry that mediates stress. The hippocampus helps an individual to record new memories, turning them from short-term to long-term, and it retrieves them later in response to specific and relevant environmental stimuli. It also helps to distinguish between past and present memories. The hippocampus facilitates appropriate responses to that environmental stimuli. So the amygdala, which you can think of as the brain's alarm system that helps us process emotions and clearing fear responses, does not go into stress mode unnecessarily. The prefrontal cortex regulates emotional responses then by controlling the functions of that amygdala. PTSD patients, or anyone that's experienced trauma, can show a considerable reduction in the volume of their hippocampus because during a traumatic event, the sudden intense release of the stress hormone cortisol can overwhelm and kill hippocampal cells. So patients with a reduced hippocampal volume lose that ability to discriminate between past and present experiences or correctly interpret environmental contexts. These particular neural mechanisms trigger extreme stress responses when confronted with environmental situations that might only remotely resemble something from their traumatic past. This is why survivors of trauma react strongly to or avoid entirely triggering environments. If you're mugged in an alley, odds are you're going to avoid anything that resembles an alley for some time. Trauma increases hyperactivity in the amygdala, which again we talked about, think of as the brain's alarm system. So this hyperactivity is in response to stimuli that are somehow connected to a person's traumatic experience. Survivors of trauma exhibit anxiety, panic, and extreme stress when they're reminded of an experience that matches theirs, or they listen to sounds or words related to their traumatic encounters. And lastly, in regards to the prefrontal cortex, emotional trauma can cause damage to it that is and because the prefrontal cortex is responsible for regulating emotional responses triggered by the amygdala, that means that the amygdala is going to go off a bit more than it should be because the prefrontal cortex is unable to regulate it. So, that explains why people suffering from PTSD tend to exhibit fear, anxiety, and extreme stress, even when faced with stimuli not connected or only remotely connected to their experiences from the past. So, in short, with an inhibited hippocampus and a functionally challenged prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, which again is that internal alarm system, is difficult to shut off or regulate regardless of how literal the perceived danger actually is. So we've talked about the inherent fears and challenges that can arise in any one of us during a crucial conversation. So we really need to remember that the effects of PTSD exacerbates those barriers. And when working with survivors, we should be aware of what a survivor is having to navigate in a conversation in addition to, everything that's just part of the human experience, all the fool's choice and all those different traps that we talked about. So this illustration is by an artist and writer from Asheville, North Carolina named Heidi Hansen, who is currently working on an illustrated book chronicling her journey healing from PTSD. I found the illustration pretty helpful and illuminating, and she does a great job of laying out some of the more common ways that trauma or PTSD can affect communication. So I want to go through those right now. So someone experiencing trauma can often feel a real powerful sense of disconnect. They're in a world often characterized by that fight-flight perception, which means they're not often aware of how they're coming across, and they might not be able to grasp another person's point of view. This can create inherent distance in communication with barriers to anticipating reactions and understanding what's being said. They can also struggle to create emotional rapport. Often trauma survivors struggle with numbness and lack of affect, which means the communication can fall apart. Lacking assertiveness. Common PTSD symptoms are learned helplessness, shock, numbness, and apathy, which can make it harder to stand up for oneself. Feeling helpless and powerless can lead to problems being heard and getting needs met successfully. This is especially important to remember, with advocates when working with survivors. Asking for help isn't easy, and we should never gauge, a client or patient's desire for help off the strength or enthusiasm of the request. Hypersensitivity. Being extremely sensitive to the person's tone, if they're rude or if they're not listening, can make someone with trauma cut off communication at even the most subtle of gestures. Also, being sensitive to standards of behavior that demonstrate trustworthiness, having a sensitivity around betrayal and breaches of trust, means they may exit the situation if someone is acting below, the standards that they're wanting to set in their relationship. Rage. Is a very common symptom. Being prone to experience sudden, feelings of rage, which is, the fight response of fight-flight, whether expressed or repressed, can lead to communication ending pretty abruptly, through arguments, cutting the other person off, it ending however it does. Trauma and PTSD can make someone's position more rigid, which of course can stop communication in its tracks. But it's important to remember that rigidness is a self-defense mechanism. In a way, it's actually, it's a way in which someone with PTSD can be assertive because they're taking back control where they can, that they've certainly lost, and prioritizing and trying to show you what they need to be safe in the conversation. As well, trauma can affect a survivor, patient, client, however you want to look at it, their ability to process information, their ability to organize information. They can struggle with a lack of concentration and focus. And a lot of that is tied around the matter of memory issues. It's one of the most prominent things that trauma affects, particularly short-term memory. Damaged hippocampus has trouble retrieving past memories, especially in the right order. It makes committing new facts to short-term memory much more difficult. And that's also a really important thing as advocates to remember because, typically in a victim services, environment, we have limited time with our clients. We want to get as much done as we can because we want to help them as quickly as we can, which can mean giving them a lot of information all at once. And even if the information seems straightforward to us, we should remember, that they may struggle to keep track of it, to remember it the next day. So while everyone has their own system for keeping track of information, I found in the past that offering notebooks to clients, both for keeping track of goals, but as well as for journaling, to-do lists, whatever is most helpful, is more readily received than not. Because if you approach it in a trauma-informed manner, hopefully they'll be grateful rather than defensive if you're suggesting that they might, need something to help with their memory. So as you can imagine, kind of from all those additional struggles that we've talked about that, survivors of PTSD have, the chance for a crucial conversation either to blow up or shut down definitely increase, more than an average crucial conversation that you might be having with someone that has not experienced trauma. So how do we handle that? How do we avoid a crucial conversation being blown up or shut down? Well, in the conversation, you want to be direct in asking for their view. And don't assume or refer at all what the response will be. They might come in hot, but you shouldn't assume that's because they don't want to work with you. So try to leave it to the side and just ask directly. You want to mirror, talking about coming in hot. If someone is coming in and they seem very upset, but they're not necessarily acknowledging that, it's okay to be their mirror and point it out. And to be fair, that's not even necessarily a trauma thing. That's often a human thing. We don't always know how we come across, or we think that we're keeping an aspect of our emotions in better check than we actually are. You want to paraphrase. Again, that advocate instinct just to go with the information is great in a lot of ways, but we want to make sure that we're getting it right. And as well, by double checking that we're getting it right, we're showing them that we're doing our best to understand. And most importantly, doing that is sending the message that it's safe for them to correct you if you're wrong. You're showing that humility. And finally, if a conversation hasn't blown up, but it seems to be shutting down and you're not really getting anywhere and you don't really know where to go, you can prime, which comes from that old expression, priming the pump. You can offer a suggestion to help prompt an opinion or a response to keep it going. So let's put this into practice. Let's take a scenario. Let's say that you are working in the main office of a residential program, and a client walks into the room. You notice her, you look up, you notice her, and she starts off in an accusatory tone. Oh wow, there's staff here for once. Now, depending on what kind of day you're having, your energy, your rest, your stress, that might make you want to respond in a less than pleasant way, because that's kind of a rude way to begin a conversation. But again, you want to put that aside. You want to do your best not to take it personally, and you can simply ask, how can we help you today? Keep it real simple, keep it real professional, and don't let that initial rudeness or however you perceive it get in the way. So let's say that you ask for help, and she responds, well, I know she's working on housing applications, but whatever, it doesn't matter. And again, that's an example where mirroring can help point out, the difference. You say it doesn't matter, but you seem upset. And then maybe she explains, that she wants to work on housing applications, but she has so much going on, she's so overwhelmed, and because of that, she doesn't know when she's going to be in the mood to do housing applications, but when she is in the mood and, seeks out her case manager, she's informed that you need to plan ahead of time and schedule a session to meet, which she doesn't think is fair because she doesn't know when she's going to be ready. So again, you want to avoid that immediate go advocate instinct and suddenly pull out a lot of applications and go, all right, well, let's do it right now. Let's get it taken care of, and you want to make sure that you are understanding her correctly, and paraphrase it back. And maybe that interaction will open a new dialogue. Maybe it'll shut her down. At which point, you can do the best you can to prime it. So you can maybe offer in a non-stressful way, no pressure way. To print out a few applications so she can have them on hand. Do what you can. Is it the perfect solution? Maybe not. But you're doing something, and at least she's going to walk away knowing that she was heard, that people want to help. That people aren't immediately assuming what she wants, off of what she initially says, which is valuable for building rapport. Some other tips for working with survivors of trauma. I have found, personally, in my experience in this field, that empathetic curiosity can open so many doors. Let's be honest, as advocates, we are in a sometimes awkward situation of having to ask very personal questions that we feel uncomfortable even asking a best friend in a pretty direct and clinical way. And that can be awkward, and that can be uncomfortable. So if you dress up all these questions with empathetic curiosity, they know you're asking because you're curious, and you're curious because you care. And as well, it allows you to be more nimble on your feet. So if you ask a question and they immediately take offense to it and shut down and don't want to answer it and are suddenly distrustful of you, if you're just asking because you're curious and you care, it's easier to pivot to, the next question or a different question rather than feeling like, it was a speeding train that just hit a wall and you didn't know where to go from there. So it allows things to be more flexible and allows you to, accommodate the moment better. You want to be deliberate in what you're asking. It's important to remember that each time a survivor repeats their story, they're going to relive it, which can exacerbate trauma. So if you already know all the details about what brought your client to you, it's always good to give them the opportunity to talk about it and process it, but there's no need for them to, recount everything for you again if you have all the information there. So not to say that we don't have to ask those difficult questions, just make sure there's a real, logical A to B reason for asking questions that might be traumatizing, or re-traumatizing, triggering, because we should save them that grief if possible. It's always okay to take a break. Advocacy at its best is definitely a relay race, involving not just you and your colleagues, but hopefully the clients as well, because that's the key to empowerment, is for them to feel like they are part of the process. So it's okay to take breaks. We would love to solve everything, in a day, but we know it's rarely like that. So if you are an advocate are realizing that, some of your conditions are changing, you're not acting your best, it's okay to, propose, hey, can we take a little break? Hey, can I hook you up with one of my other colleagues who might have some other opinions on this? Be honest, because, we're all human here, even if we're here to help other humans. And just as importantly, it's important for the client to know it's okay to take a break. Because we talked about often in client counselor relationships, both parties are aware that their time is limited and you got to make the most of it. So that can make it pretty intimidating for a client to go, you know what, I know I only have so much time here, but I need to take a break. And we have to remember, because those power differentials that are inherently going to be there, they might not feel it's okay to be the one to propose a break. So you want to be paying attention to their conditions and making sure that they're still in it, because if they're not, you might be wasting everyone's time by continuing a conversation that they're unable to process and keep with. It is so important to remember that your safety, physical and emotional, always matters and should never be ignored. It's absolutely important. We talked today about making sure that the other people in the conversation feel safe. As advocates, our attention is always focused outward, and that's great. That's why we're in the field, and Lord knows we need more people like us here. Not to pat our backs too much, but that means that you can be blind to or not give proper credence to your own safety. So keep an eye on that. There's nothing ever wrong, with that, at least temporarily stepping out of a situation if it doesn't feel safe. If you're not sure, but even if you have that hunch, step out long enough to figure out what doesn't feel safe and correct it. Because your safety always matters here. And lastly, don't take it personally. Now, as we talked about, we all make errors, we all make mistakes, and sometimes you got to apologize. But more often than not, if you're in a conversation with someone that has a lot on their plate, is experiencing stress, trauma, PTSD, if an explosion or a reaction happens that is initially hurtful to you, but you can't find a single reason for why it was deserved, just chalk it up to, they're upset, and, lucky you're the one that's just happening to, you're the one facing the energy in that moment. And it doesn't mean that energy isn't valid. It just doesn't mean that you have to take it on as something that you did wrong, and that you need to fix. You're here to help, you're here to help your clients, but you don't have to, find their inner peace in the moment, because that's a process for them when they're on it, and you're just part of that journey. So that is what I have to share with you guys today. Here is my contact information, as well as more information about Crucial Conversations. And if anyone's interested in Heidi Hansen's blog, the woman that wrote that did that illustration and is working on that book. That's all right there. Of course, since we do have time, if anyone has any questions, comments, anything, we're happy to, make this more collaborative. So feel free to speak up if you got anything. Yes, I can certainly make sure that everyone has access to the PowerPoint presentation. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you all so much for attending. This was my first webinar with the Coalition, so thanks for being part of that personal history for me. If no one has anything else, we will be closing down the webinar in a moment. I believe there'll be a recording available later. I'll get back to you on that, but yes, certainly if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, my email address is right there. I can get it to you pronto, so do not hesitate to ask for it if you want it. Thanks so much, everyone.